When I first met my daughter-in-law's family, I wore the same faded floral dress I'd been saving for church Sundays. It had a small tear near the sleeve and smelled faintly of the soap I'd used to wash it by hand that morning. I tied my hair back with an old rubber band, put on my worn sandals, and looked at myself in the mirror. I remember whispering softly, "You'll do just fine, Margaret." The truth was, I wasn't nervous about meeting them because I doubted myself. I was nervous because I already knew what kind of people they were. My son Daniel had told me, bits and pieces, how his fiancé's family liked things a certain way, how they believed in standards and presentation. Words that sounded harmless until you saw how they used them. I decided that day I wouldn't meet them as the woman who ran a small bookkeeping business from home, or as someone who'd spent half her life raising a son alone after his father walked away. No, I would meet them as they might expect me to be, simple, plain, and maybe just a little naive. I told myself it would help me understand them better. But deep down, it was more than that. I wanted to see how they treated someone they thought was beneath them. Daniel had met Emily 2 years ago at a work event. He was bright, ambitious, the kind of young man who still called his mother every Sunday and told her about his week. When he told me he was serious about someone, I could hear the hope in his voice. I wanted to be happy for him, and I was, but I'd seen too many hearts bruised by pride disguised as love. Still, when I saw the light in his eyes, I thought maybe this time would be different. Emily was polite when I first met her, sweet even. She had that kind of calm confidence that makes you want to like her. But I could sense the invisible line between us, something unspoken that said, "We come from different worlds." The meeting with her family was to take place at their home, a 2-story house with white shutters and a manicured lawn that looked like it had been trimmed by angels. I remember the smell of lavender in the air as I walked up their driveway, clutching a small box of homemade cookies. My hands trembled slightly. I'd baked those cookies myself the night before, using my old recipe that Daniel loved as a boy. The house door opened before I could knock. A tall woman with pearl earrings and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes greeted me. "You must be Daniel's mother," she said, her tone dripping with politeness. "I'm Linda, Emily's mother. Please, come in." Her husband Richard followed behind her, holding a glass of red wine even though it was barely noon. He gave me a brief nod, one of those quick, practiced gestures people give when they're not sure if shaking your hand is worth the effort. I smiled anyway and thanked them for inviting me. The living room was large, immaculate, and decorated with things that looked expensive but oddly lifeless, a showcase more than a home. I noticed the way Linda's eyes flicked toward my dress, her lips curling slightly before she caught herself. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing toward a cream-colored couch that looked too clean to touch. Emily came down the stairs a moment later, radiant and cheerful, and for a brief second I saw what Daniel saw in her, that warmth that made everything else fade away. She hugged me lightly, then led me to the table where lunch had been set. There were more utensils than I knew what to do with, but I simply followed Emily's lead. "These look wonderful," I said as Linda began serving. "Oh, it's just something simple," she replied, though the dishes looked like they'd come straight from a 5-star restaurant. The conversation began politely, questions about Daniel's work, the wedding plans, and how long I'd lived in town. But soon, the tone shifted. "So, Margaret," Richard began, swirling his wine, "what do you do?" I paused, knowing exactly what he was fishing for. "Oh, nothing much," I said softly, keeping my eyes down. "Just a bit of bookkeeping here and there. I mostly stay home these days." Linda smiled, that kind of smile that's meant to look kind but feels like a cut. "That's lovely," she said. "A simple life. Not everyone needs ambition." I smiled back and nodded, pretending I hadn't noticed the weight of her words. As the meal went on, I could feel their quiet judgment pressing around me like invisible fog. The way Linda leaned slightly toward Richard whenever I spoke. The way they exchanged looks when I mentioned Daniel's modest apartment. Even the maid, a young woman moving silently behind us, seemed to sense the tension. But I stayed composed, polite, gentle. Because this wasn't about pride, it was about patience. I wanted them to show me who they really were, without any mask. When dessert was served, Linda brought out a glossy cake and said, "Emily tells us you live in the old neighborhood near Oak Street. Must be quite nostalgic." Her tone lingered on that word, as if nostalgia was another word for poverty. I smiled faintly and replied, "Yes, it's where Daniel grew up. Small house, but full of good memories." Richard chuckled. "Well, every man has to start somewhere," he said, cutting into his slice. "I'm sure Daniel appreciates new opportunities." Emily looked uncomfortable, glancing at me with quiet apology, but I simply nodded, sipping my tea. I had no intention of defending myself, not yet. There's a strange power in silence, especially when people think it comes from ignorance. They reveal more than they mean to. As I left that afternoon, Linda handed me a bag of leftovers, wrapped neatly, tied with a bow. "For you, dear," she said. "You probably don't cook this kind of food often." I took it with a smile and thanked her. On the drive home, the sun was setting over the fields, turning everything gold. I could still hear her voice echoing in my mind, soft and sweet and sharp underneath. I knew then that this wasn't going to be an easy family to blend with. But I also knew something they didn't, that humility is often the quietest form of strength. That night, Daniel called me. "Mom, I hope they didn't say anything strange. They can be a little much." I laughed lightly and told him everything was fine. But as I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was only the beginning, and that pretending to be naive might just be the smartest decision I ever made. The morning after that lunch, I woke up before sunrise, the way I always did. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint chirping outside my kitchen window. I brewed my coffee, poured it into my old chipped mug, and sat by the window watching the sky shift from gray to pink. There's something about mornings like that. They remind you of who you are when no one's watching. I wasn't thinking about the Lindas and Richards of the world, or even about Emily. I was thinking about Daniel, about the boy who used to run through this kitchen with peanut butter on his cheeks and homework forgotten in his backpack. I'd raised him alone after his father left when Daniel was 8. Those were hard years, but they made us close. Closer than I think many mothers and sons ever become. He'd always said, "Mom, when I make it, you'll never have to worry again." But I never wanted that kind of promise. I just wanted him to stay kind. My little bookkeeping business wasn't much, but it paid the bills and kept me busy. I handled accounts for local shops and a small charity, mostly people who paid late but meant well. My house was small but warm, the kind where every corner held a memory. The old couch Daniel had once spilled grape juice on, the dining table I'd bought secondhand 20 years ago, the faded pictures on the wall of birthdays, graduations, and Christmas mornings. Every item had a story, and every story reminded me that love doesn't need to look rich to feel rich. The days following that first meeting, Daniel and Emily visited often. She'd bring little things, scented candles, store-bought desserts, sometimes flowers, small gestures that made me wonder if she was trying to bridge the distance her parents had built. Emily wasn't cruel. I could tell she was caught between two worlds, between loyalty to her family and love for Daniel. She'd compliment my cooking, ask me about recipes, and help clean the table without being asked. But sometimes she'd slip, just a glance or a word, and I'd see the subtle conditioning of her upbringing. Once, when I mentioned that Daniel and I used to take the bus together when he was a kid, she said softly, "Oh, that must have been tough." I smiled, hiding my amusement. "Not really," I replied. It gave us time to talk. Their wedding was approaching fast, and though I'd offered to help, Linda had made it clear that the planning was handled. Still, I wanted to contribute something meaningful. So I started sewing a quilt for them, one made from pieces of old fabric I'd kept from Daniel's childhood. His baby blanket, my old curtains, even a strip from the dress I'd worn on his first day of school. I worked on it at night, under the yellow lamp in my living room, humming softly to myself. Each stitch felt like a prayer, a quiet wish that Emily's family might one day see the love that didn't come wrapped in money or titles. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel stopped by alone. He looked tired, more tense than usual. "Mom," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I need to ask you something." I set my tea down and looked at him carefully. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" He hesitated before saying, "Emily's parents want to handle all the wedding expenses, but they also suggested it might be better if you don't contribute financially. They said they don't want you to feel pressured." His voice trailed off at the end, heavy with embarrassment. I could see how much it pained him to even say the words. I smiled gently and reached across the table to touch his hand. "Daniel," I said softly, "I'm not worried about the money. You just focus on being happy." He looked at me with that same boyish guilt he used to have when he broke something as a kid. "Mom, I'm sorry. They shouldn't have—" I stopped him with a small shake of my head. "It's all right. Some people only see value in what can be bought. But that doesn't mean we have to." He sighed deeply and nodded, but I could tell the conversation weighed on him. Later that evening, I found myself thinking about Linda and Richard again. I wasn't angry, not yet, but there was a small ember of something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't revenge. It was curiosity. What makes people so certain they're better than others? Was it their money, their education, their house? I wanted to understand. And I wanted to teach them, not through confrontation, but through patience. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from quiet observation. A week later, Emily invited me to a pre-wedding brunch her mother was hosting. "It'll just be a few people," she said sweetly over the phone. "I really want you there." I agreed, of course, even though I could already guess what kind of few people Linda had invited. Polished friends with polished smiles. This time I wore the same floral dress. I could have chosen something nicer. I had better clothes, but I wanted to remain consistent in their eyes. If they wanted to underestimate me, I'd give them every chance. When I arrived, the brunch was in full swing. The backyard was decorated with pastel balloons, white tablecloths, and a buffet that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Linda was at the center of it all, moving gracefully between guests, her laughter crisp and rehearsed. When she spotted me, her expression tightened for a brief second before she composed herself. "Margaret, dear, so glad you could come." She introduced me around with a tone that bordered on condescending, as if she were doing me a favor by acknowledging me. Throughout the brunch, I listened more than I spoke. The conversations around me were about investment portfolios, golf trips, and vacation homes. At one point, a woman beside me asked, "So, what do you do, Margaret?" I smiled kindly and said, "Oh, I just keep myself busy at home." She nodded, clearly losing interest, and turned back to her champagne. I excused myself quietly and went to help the maid refill the lemonade pitchers. The girl looked startled. "Oh, ma'am, you don't have to," I smiled. "It's all right. I'm better with my hands busy," Linda noticed, of course. Her eyes flickered toward me from across the table, something between discomfort and disapproval crossing her face. As I stood there pouring lemonade, listening to the laughter echo across the yard, I realized something. I didn't mind that they saw me as simple. In fact, I preferred it. Because someday when the truth came out, when they discovered who I really was and what I really had, it wouldn't be me who looked small. It would be them. The next few weeks passed in a blur of wedding preparations, fittings, and family dinners. Daniel tried to keep me included, but it was clear that Linda had taken full control of everything. From the choice of flowers to the seating arrangements, she handled it all as if she were the queen of some small kingdom. I didn't mind. I'd long learned that people like Linda measure love through control, not kindness. Still, something about her behavior started to shift, subtle at first, like the quiet tightening of a thread you don't notice until it snaps. It began the evening she called me unexpectedly. Her voice was polite, but there was a layer of forced warmth beneath it. "Margaret, dear, I was wondering if you'd be comfortable wearing something understated to the wedding. The photographers will be capturing quite a lot of formal shots, and I just want everything to look cohesive." I smiled to myself, sitting at my kitchen table with my cup of tea. "Of course, Linda, I wouldn't want to outshine the bride." She let out a quick laugh, then fell silent, unsure if I was joking. "You're very understanding," she finally said. Not everyone would take it so graciously. That night, I went to my closet and pulled out the dress I'd originally planned to wear, a navy gown with delicate lace sleeves, elegant but modest. It had been a gift from an old friend, someone I'd helped start a small business years ago. The dress wasn't new, but it carried quiet sophistication. I hung it carefully on the door and stared at it for a long time, wondering why I was letting people like Linda dictate anything about my life. But then I remembered I wasn't trying to impress them. I was trying to see them clearly. And sometimes you see people best when they think you're beneath their notice. A few days later, Daniel invited me to dinner at his apartment. Emily had cooked, and the smell of rosemary and garlic filled the air when I arrived. The table was set with candles and soft music played in the background. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, like two families blending into something whole. But then, halfway through the meal, Linda's name came up again. "Mom?" Daniel began cautiously. "Emily's parents are planning a small engagement gift for us, a contribution toward a new car." He hesitated, glancing at Emily, who smiled nervously. "They also mentioned it might be better if you didn't bring a gift to the wedding. They said it would make things simpler." I looked between the two of them, my fork resting on the edge of my plate. "Simpler for whom?" I asked quietly. Emily looked down. "They just don't want you to feel pressured to spend money." "My mom said," I stopped her with a gentle hand on hers. "Emily," I said softly, "you don't need to explain. I understand, but inside I felt something twist. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was disappointment. They weren't just trying to control how I looked. They were trying to erase me from the picture altogether. As if my love for Daniel needed permission. I finished the meal with a calm smile, thanked them both, and went home early. That night, as I sat in my living room with the half-finished quilt across my lap, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I was starting to see that this wasn't about class or appearances anymore. This was about respect, and the quiet ways people try to take it from you. The next clue came at the bridal fitting. Emily had insisted I come along, saying she wanted me there for support. Linda was there too, of course, standing near the mirror like a director overseeing her masterpiece. Emily looked stunning in her gown, pure, elegant, glowing with happiness. I couldn't help but smile. But as she twirled, Linda leaned toward one of the boutique assistants and whispered something. The young woman's eyes flicked toward me before she quickly looked away. I pretended not to notice, but a moment later, another assistant approached me and said sweetly, "Ma'am, there's a lounge area over there if you'd like to sit. We'll bring you some water." It was kind but unnecessary. No one else had been offered to move. It was clear she was trying to get me out of the frame. I sat down quietly, watching from a distance as Linda fussed over every detail. When Emily turned to ask my opinion about the veil, Linda interrupted. "Oh, sweetheart, let's not overwhelm her. She's probably not used to all these choices." I smiled faintly, biting back my response. Emily frowned but said nothing. It wasn't until later, when I was leaving the store, that one of the boutique staff accidentally revealed something that made me pause. "It was kind of you," she said, "to let Mrs. Thompson take care of everything. She mentioned you didn't really have the means to help." She said it innocently, without malice. I smiled and thanked her, but inside a quiet spark ignited. So Linda had been telling people I was poor, not just modest, but struggling. Driving home that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way she'd said it, the way she probably framed me to her friends, as the pitiful mother-in-law to be tolerated. I'd seen this kind of cruelty before. It's the kind that hides behind manners and polished words. I thought about calling her, about confronting her outright, but something stopped me. Instead, I decided to wait. Because sometimes the best way to expose people like Linda isn't to argue with them. It's to let them speak long enough to reveal themselves. A few days later, Daniel came by again. He looked uneasy, like he was carrying something he didn't want to say. "Mom," he began, "can I ask you something? Did you tell Emily's parents that you needed financial help?" I froze, then looked at him carefully. "Why would I say that?" He shifted awkwardly. "Linda mentioned it to me. She said you hinted that money was tight. She even offered to help with your dress." I felt my chest tighten. So that's what she was doing. Weaving stories, planting pity, trying to make me smaller in her son's eyes. I smiled faintly and said, "No, Daniel, I didn't say that. And I don't need their help." He nodded, clearly conflicted. "I didn't believe it," he said quietly. "But I just wanted to ask." After he left, I sat in silence, staring at the quilt draped across the chair. I ran my fingers over the fabric, over the stitches that held so many years of love and sacrifice. And I made a promise to myself that on the day of the wedding, I wouldn't just attend as the mother they pitied. I would remind them, in my own quiet way, that dignity doesn't need decoration. The days leading up to the wedding felt like walking through a fog, everyone moving, smiling, planning. But beneath it all there was tension, something unspoken that hovered between every word. I kept my composure, doing what I'd always done best, staying calm while I watched. It was the night before the rehearsal dinner when everything began to unravel. I had driven to the Thompson house, Linda and Richard's, because Emily had asked me to drop off a few family photos for a slideshow. It was early evening, the sky painted with orange light, and I could hear faint laughter as I approached the front door. It was slightly ajar, so I knocked softly before pushing it open. I stepped inside and called out, "Hello? It's Margaret." No one answered right away, so I followed the sound of voices into the living room. They hadn't seen me yet. Linda was standing near the fireplace with her friend, a woman I didn't know, while Richard sat in his armchair with a glass of wine. Their conversation was low but clear enough to hear every word. "I just hope Daniel doesn't end up resenting us for marrying down," Linda said, her tone casual, almost bored. Her friend chuckled. "Oh, he seems smitten enough." It'll wear off once he realizes he's the only one working for the rest of his life. Linda laughed softly. Please, that boy's mother looks like she counts pennies. Did you see that old dress she wore to the brunch? Honestly, I almost felt sorry for her, Richard grunted. You're too soft, Linda. You should be glad she's quiet. The last thing we need is a pushy in-law trying to insert herself into everything. I stood frozen, my fingers gripping the box of photos. My heart thudded so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, I thought about walking away, pretending I hadn't heard. But then Linda spoke again, and this time her voice was sharper. Honestly, I told Emily to be cautious. People like that always want something. First, it's help with the wedding, then it's help with bills. She probably expects Daniel to start sending her money every month. I told Emily that generosity needs boundaries. Her friend murmured something in agreement, and Linda continued, You know what the sad part is? She acts so sweet, but I can see right through it. That fake humility, it's an act. They all do it, those people who never had much. They play poor to guilt you into treating them better. Something inside me cracked open then. I'd been insulted before in my life, by strangers, by circumstance, by people who didn't know better. But hearing it from the woman who would soon call herself my family, who smiled to my face and spoke poison behind my back, that hit differently. I quietly set the box of photos on the nearest table and took a deep breath before stepping into the doorway. The sound of my voice startled them. You might be right about one thing, Linda, I said softly, my tone calm but steady. I do act humble. But it isn't an act. Their faces turned toward me, Linda's mouth slightly open, Richard's brows furrowed. Margaret, she began, but I raised my hand. Please don't explain. I think I've heard enough. For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. I could see Linda's mind racing, searching for an excuse, a way to smooth things over. You shouldn't have come in like that, she said finally, her tone defensive. We were just talking privately. You've misunderstood, I smiled faintly. No, Linda, I understood perfectly. I turned and walked toward the door, but before leaving, I paused and looked back at her. You know, I said softly, when I came here the first time, I thought maybe you just needed time to know me. That maybe you judged too quickly. But now I see it's not about who I am, it's about who you think you are. And with that, I left. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every word I'd heard replayed in my head, cutting deeper each time. But beneath the hurt, something else began to form, a quiet strength. I thought about all the years I'd spent building a life out of nothing. The nights I'd worked late to keep the lights on, the sacrifices I'd made to send Daniel to college, the moments I'd held my head high even when I had every reason not to. I realized that the version of me Linda mocked, the poor, naive mother, was the same woman who had taught her son what love, work, and integrity really meant. The next morning, Daniel called me. His voice was tight. Mom, what happened last night? Emily said her mom's upset. She said you overheard something? I closed my eyes and took a breath. Yes, Daniel. I did. There was a long pause. What did she say? I hesitated, not wanting to hurt him, but knowing the truth had to be told. She said things about me, about us, that were unkind. Things that made it clear she doesn't respect where you come from. His silence told me he already suspected it. I'm so sorry, Mom, he whispered. I didn't know she'd gone that far. I tried to keep my voice steady. It's all right, sweetheart. Some people mistake wealth for worth. But don't let this come between you and Emily. She's not her mother. After the call, I sat for a long time, thinking about what to do. I could confront Linda publicly. I could tell Emily everything, maybe even embarrass them at their own event. But that wasn't my way. I didn't want revenge. I wanted dignity. So instead, I made a different plan, one that would speak louder than anger ever could. I went to my bedroom closet and pulled out a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were photographs, documents, and awards, reminders of a part of my life few people knew about. Before I started my bookkeeping business, I'd built and sold a small accounting firm. I'd managed finances for several successful local companies. I wasn't rich, but I was far from poor. I had quietly invested my savings, and the returns had been kind. My simplicity wasn't necessity. It was choice. I'd never flaunted what I had because I didn't need to. But now perhaps it was time to let them see who they'd been underestimating. As I held those papers in my hand, I smiled to myself. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about reminding them that kindness, humility, and self-respect are never signs of weakness. Sometimes they're the greatest strengths a person can have. And when the wedding day came, I would show them, not with words, but with grace. The morning of the wedding arrived wrapped in mist, a soft gray light that made everything feel quieter than it should have been. My alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., though I'd barely slept at all. I sat up in bed, took a deep breath, and reminded myself, today is Daniel's day. Nothing else matters. I brewed a small pot of coffee, letting the smell fill the kitchen while I watched the sun rise through the window. My hands shook a little as I buttered toast, not from fear, but from a strange mix of pride and melancholy. My little boy, the one I used to tuck into bed after long nights of double shifts, was getting married. When I looked in the mirror, I took my time getting ready. I chose a soft dove gray gown, elegant but simple. Around my neck, I fastened the small pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother, the only piece of jewelry I truly cherished. My hair, streaked with silver, was brushed smooth, pinned low. For the first time in years, I wore light makeup. I looked calm, unbothered, exactly how I wanted to be seen. At the venue, everything shimmered with gold ribbons, white roses, tables set like a royal banquet. Emily looked radiant in her gown, nervous and excited. Daniel looked every bit the man I'd raised, strong, kind, steady. When he saw me, he broke into a smile. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said softly, pulling me into a hug. "Thank you for being here," I smiled back. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." Across the hall, I caught sight of Linda and Richard. She was wearing a shimmering emerald dress, dripping with jewelry that gleamed under the chandeliers. Our eyes met briefly. She hesitated, then looked away. It was the first time I'd seen guilt on her face. Not remorse exactly, but discomfort. She knew I'd heard every word, and that knowledge unsettled her more than I could have imagined. I didn't approach her, not yet. The day wasn't about confrontation. It was about celebration and quiet revelation. When the ceremony began, I sat in the front row, hands folded in my lap. As Emily walked down the aisle, Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I felt my own throat tighten. Whatever Linda's faults, she'd raised a daughter who clearly loved my son, and that was enough for me to keep peace, at least for today. After the vows were exchanged and the applause died down, the reception began. The air buzzed with laughter, music, and clinking glasses. Everyone was radiant with joy. I mingled politely, greeting guests, thanking people for their kindness. But I could feel Linda's gaze following me from across the room, curious, uneasy. Then came the speeches. Daniel spoke first, his voice strong and full of emotion. He thanked everyone for being there, for helping him and Emily start their new life. Then he looked at me, and to my mother. He said, his voice thick. "I just want to say everything I am, I owe to you. You taught me what love means, what resilience looks like, and how to be proud without needing to prove anything. I love you, Mom." There was a murmur of appreciation through the crowd, and I could feel dozens of eyes turn toward me. I stood slowly, smiling. "And I love you too, sweetheart," I said softly. "Always." It should have ended there, but Daniel, bless his heart, wasn't finished. He looked at Linda's side of the family and continued, "You know, growing up, my mom built everything we had from the ground up. She ran her own business, raised me alone, and somehow managed to make every day feel full, even when times were tough. I hope I can give Emily the same kind of home she gave me." There was polite applause, and in the corner of my eye, I saw Linda's expression falter. That mask of superiority cracked for just a moment. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the microphone. My hands didn't tremble. My heart didn't race. I was completely still, like I'd been waiting my whole life for this moment. I wasn't planning on saying much, I began, my voice calm but steady. But after hearing my son's words, I think I'll share a little story. The room went quiet. When Daniel was 12, I said, smiling softly, I was working 3 jobs. There was a night he came to me and asked, "Mom, are we poor?" And I told him something I still believe today. We are only poor when we start measuring ourselves by what others have instead of who we are. A few people nodded. I glanced across the room. Linda's eyes were fixed on me now. "I've met many people in my life who mistake money for class," I continued, "who think having more means being more. But true grace, true dignity, isn't something you can buy or inherit. It's how you treat people when no one's watching. It's how you speak about others when they're not in the room." The silence deepened. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Linda's hand tightened around her glass. So today, I said gently, as we celebrate this union, I just want to remind us all that family isn't about background or status or what's written in a bank account. It's about love. And love doesn't need validation. I smiled, raising my glass. To Daniel and Emily, may you always build each other up, never tear anyone down, and never forget where kindness begins. There was a moment's pause, then applause filled the hall. People rose to their feet, clapping, smiling. I sat down quietly, my heart full but calm. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. That was perfect, he whispered. Linda didn't speak to me for most of the night. But I didn't need her to, because later, as the crowd began to thin and people moved toward the dance floor, she approached. Her posture was stiff, her smile small but practiced. Margaret, she said softly. That was a lovely speech. I turned to her, meeting her gaze evenly. Thank you, Linda, I meant every word. She hesitated, then looked down. I realize I may have misjudged you. I tilted my head slightly. Perhaps. But I don't hold it against you. We all see what we want to see until life shows us otherwise. She nodded slowly, her eyes glassy. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed human. Not cruel, not superior, just flawed and learning. Before she could say anything more, Daniel and Emily called me to the dance floor. I smiled, excused myself, and let them lead me into the circle of music and laughter. As I danced with my son under the soft golden lights, I felt something inside me settle, a quiet peace. Not because I'd won or proved anything, but because I'd stayed true to myself. In the end, dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't fight for validation. It simply stands calm and unwavering until the truth reveals itself. And that night, as I watched Daniel and Emily sway together, her in his arms, love shining in both their eyes, I knew that whatever came next, my story had found its closure. After the wedding, life moved forward the way it always does, slowly at first, then all at once. The noise faded, the flowers wilted, and the new couple slipped into their honeymoon phase, leaving the rest of us to return to our normal lives. But normal felt different now. Something had shifted, not just between me and Linda, but in how I saw myself. For years, I had allowed others to decide my worth. I'd grown used to shrinking in rooms where wealth or status spoke louder than kindness. I'd thought humility meant staying quiet, but standing quietly that night at the wedding, speaking truth without anger, I realized humility and silence are not the same thing. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Emily invited both families to their new home for dinner. It was a modest suburban house, nothing extravagant, but filled with warmth, the kind that money can't buy. When I arrived, Emily greeted me with open arms. "Mom, you're here early," she said, beaming. The word mom still melted me. "I wanted to help you set the table," I said with a smile, handing her a bouquet of lilies. Linda and Richard arrived shortly after, dressed neatly but without the showiness I'd come to expect. They looked softer somehow. Linda, especially, seemed quieter, as if something in her had been stirred. I greeted them warmly. "It's good to see you both," I said. She smiled faintly. "It's good to see you too, Margaret." The dinner was lovely. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, corn salad, and Emily's favorite chocolate mousse. Conversation flowed easily at first. Stories about the wedding, travel plans, funny moments from childhood. But as dessert plates were being cleared, Linda suddenly spoke up. Her tone was careful, but her words were clear. "Margaret," she began, "I owe you an apology." The room went still. Emily froze. Daniel glanced between us. Linda looked down at her folded hands before continuing. "Before the wedding, I said some things that were unkind. I misjudged you, and that wasn't fair." I studied her face. There was no trace of arrogance now, only humility, the kind that doesn't come easy. I nodded slowly. "Thank you, Linda. I appreciate that." She met my eyes. "You showed me something that day, something I've been thinking about ever since. You didn't try to prove yourself. You didn't fight. You just stood in truth. I realized I've spent too much of my life confusing wealth with worth." Her voice trembled slightly. "It's an easy trap to fall into." I smiled gently. "We all fall into it sometimes. What matters is that we recognize it when we do." Daniel exhaled softly, a small smile on his face. Emily reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it. The moment felt like a healing, quiet, unplanned, but real. After dinner, as everyone began to leave, Linda lingered by the door. She turned to me, hesitating for a moment before saying, You know, I didn't grow up rich either. I came from very little. I think I was afraid of ever feeling small again, and I let that fear turn me into someone I didn't like. Her voice cracked slightly. I placed a hand on her arm. Then you understand more than you realize, I said softly. We all build armor to survive, but it's never too late to put it down. She nodded, eyes glossy. I'd like to start over. If you'll let me, I smiled. I already have. That night, as I drove home, the streets shimmered with rain. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement like golden threads weaving through the dark. I rolled down the window, breathing in the cool air. For the first time in years, my heart felt light. Over the following months, our relationship slowly thawed. Linda began inviting me over for tea. Sometimes she'd call to ask about recipes or to share pictures of Emily and Daniel. It wasn't forced, just small, genuine gestures. There was no grand apology, no dramatic transformation. Just two women learning to meet each other where pride once stood. One afternoon, she surprised me by visiting my home. She brought a basket of fruit and a small wrapped box. For you, she said. Inside was a simple framed quote that read, "Grace is not weakness. It's strength wrapped in quiet." I looked up, touched. "It's beautiful," I whispered. She smiled faintly. "It reminded me of you." We sat together for hours that day. Two mothers, no longer rivals, just women who'd lived enough to understand what really matters. She told me about her own struggles, about how fear of judgment had driven many of her choices. I listened, and for the first time, I saw her not as the proud woman who had mocked me, but as someone still trying to heal her own insecurities. It made me think about how often we misread people, how easy it is to see arrogance where there's really fear, or to see confidence where there's loneliness. Life humbles all of us one way or another. Months later, when Daniel and Emily announced they were expecting their first child, both families celebrated together. We laughed, cried, and toasted to new beginnings. During the baby shower, Linda stood beside me, smiling at her daughter. "You know," she whispered, "I'm glad Emily married into your family. You've taught us all something about grace." I chuckled softly. "And you've taught me something too, that sometimes people only grow when they're given space to see themselves clearly." As the evening wound down, I stood by the window watching the younger ones laugh and dance. Daniel caught my eye from across the room and mouthed, "Thank you." I just smiled. He didn't need to say more. He'd seen everything, the pride, the pain, the healing, and understood what it had cost. Later that night, as I sat alone on my porch, the crickets singing in the dark, I thought back to the moment I'd decided to play the poor, naive mother. How strange that what began as an act of quiet rebellion had ended up teaching all of us something deeper. About appearances, about dignity, about love that doesn't need to boast. People often think strength looks loud, sharp words, raised voices, proving points. But I've learned it often looks like silence, patience, and the ability to smile when you know the truth will reveal itself in time. And it always does. In the weeks after that dinner, word about Linda's apology, or at least the change in our relationship, spread quietly through our extended families and mutual circles. We lived in a small enough town that news like that traveled faster than we'd like to admit. People noticed the shift. They noticed that when Linda spoke about me now, her tone carried softness instead of sarcasm. They noticed how we sometimes arrived at family gatherings together, laughing at something private, as if years of frost had melted overnight. But what surprised me most wasn't how others saw it. It was how they reacted to her. There had been women in her circle, friends who once gossiped with her about that poor mother from the other side of town. Suddenly, they didn't know quite what to make of her humility. One afternoon, during a charity luncheon we both attended, I overheard one of those women, a Mrs. Cartwright, whisper to another, "Linda's changed. Ever since that wedding, she's different. Softer. Almost like she's ashamed of herself." Linda heard it too. For a second, her shoulders stiffened. I caught her eye from across the table. She gave a faint, knowing smile, and instead of snapping back or pretending not to hear, she just said, "Maybe I am ashamed. But that's how growth begins, doesn't it?" The table fell silent. Mrs. Cartwright flushed and looked away. It was a small moment, but it told me everything. The woman who once cared so deeply about appearances now cared more about truth. A few weeks later, our families gathered again, this time for Thanksgiving at Daniel and Emily's house. It was the first big event since their wedding, and everyone was excited. The house smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh-baked pies. Children ran through the hallways, laughter spilling like music. I stood by the counter helping Emily with the gravy while Linda arranged flowers on the dining table. At one point, Richard came over with a glass of wine and chuckled. "You two make quite the team now," he said. Linda smirked playfully. "Who would have thought?" I laughed softly. Life has its ways of surprising us. As dinner began, the room buzzed with warmth. Daniel stood to give a toast. "I just want to say," he began, looking around the table, "that this is the first time I've ever seen both sides of our family so at peace. It means the world to Emily and me." Everyone clapped and cheered. Linda raised her glass toward me. "To peace," she said. "To peace," I echoed. But not everyone was so quick to adapt. After dinner, while I was in the kitchen washing dishes, one of Linda's cousins, a woman named Sylvia, came in, her tone dripping with curiosity. "So, Margaret," she said, leaning against the counter, "I heard you run some kind of business. That's quite ambitious of you." I smiled politely, sensing the underlying tone. "Yes, I've been managing a small design firm for about 20 years now." She blinked, clearly taken aback. "Oh, I didn't realize it was that long. Linda never mentioned it." Before I could respond, Linda walked in, drying her hands on a napkin. "That's because I was too busy talking about myself," she said with a wry smile. Margaret's being modest. Her firm's work is actually quite well known in the city. Sylvia's face flushed slightly. "Oh, I see. Well, that's impressive." Linda gave her a pointed look. "It is." I hid my smile behind the steam from the sink. There was no satisfaction in watching Sylvia shrink, only quiet amusement at how poetic life can be. The woman who once questioned my worth now defended it to others, not out of guilt, but respect. Later that evening, as the night wound down, Daniel came to me while I sat on the porch sipping tea. "You handled that beautifully, Mom," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "With Sylvia. You could have told her off, but you didn't." I smiled. Sometimes silence teaches louder than words. He nodded thoughtfully, sitting beside me. "You've changed too, you know." I glanced at him. "How so?" "You seem lighter, happier. Like you're not carrying the world on your shoulders anymore." I chuckled softly. Maybe I finally put it down. Inside, Linda was laughing, with Emily holding her hand over her heart as they reminisced about old stories. The sound of it, pure, genuine laughter, was something I never thought I'd hear from her in my direction. In the following months, things continued to evolve. Our families blended in ways I hadn't expected. We started hosting joint dinners, celebrating birthdays together, sharing holidays without that sharp edge of judgment that used to hang in the air. But the real change came when Linda joined a women's community outreach program in town, the same one I'd been part of for years. At first, she came quietly, sitting in the back during meetings, listening more than speaking. But soon, she began contributing ideas, volunteering, even mentoring younger women from underprivileged backgrounds. One afternoon during one of those sessions, she stood up and spoke. "A year ago," she said to the group, "I would have told you I understood success. I thought it meant stability, reputation, comfort. But I've learned that real success is the ability to look someone in the eye without pretense and see yourself in them." Her words moved the room to tears. I sat near the back, watching her with quiet pride. I never told her how deeply that moment touched me, how much it meant to see someone change not because they were shamed, but because they were given the chance to see goodness up close. That night, she sent me a text message, just one line. "Thank you for teaching me without ever trying to." I stared at it for a long while before replying, "You taught yourself, Linda." I just held up the mirror. Sometimes I think about that first meeting, the way she'd looked at me in my simple dress, how she'd mistaken kindness for ignorance. If I had fought her that day, if I had thrown my truth in her face, maybe she never would have learned. But by letting her underestimate me, she was forced to face her own reflection. And when people finally saw the truth, that money and pride, can't outshine humility and strength. It didn't humiliate her. It freed her. By the time Emily gave birth to their daughter, our families had become inseparable. At the hospital, when the nurse brought the baby out, Linda and I stood side by side, holding each other's hands, tears filling our eyes. "She's perfect," she whispered. "She is," I said softly. "She'll grow up knowing what love looks like, in all its forms." The baby cooed, tiny fingers curling around mine, and in that moment, I knew every wound, every test, every misunderstanding had led us exactly here. The weeks after little Clara was born felt like sunlight after a long winter, soft, golden, healing. The entire family seemed renewed, almost as if the baby had washed away the last traces of pride, resentment, and misunderstanding that lingered between us. Every time I held her, tiny and warm against my chest, I could feel her heartbeat syncing with mine, reminding me that every generation deserves a better start than the one before it. Linda was a different woman now, still elegant, still poised, but gentler. The sharp edges that used to define her words had been softened by humility. She visited often, bringing Clara little gifts, sometimes just sitting beside me while we watched the baby sleep. One afternoon, while Daniel and Emily were out running errands, we found ourselves alone in the living room. The house was quiet, sunlight pouring in through the curtains, dust particles dancing like gold in the air. Linda cradled Clara, rocking her slowly. "You know," she said softly, "I've been thinking a lot about that first day we met." I smiled faintly. "Oh, that day was something," she chuckled, then shook her head. "I was awful to you." "You were honest," I said gently. "Just in a way that hurt." Her eyes filled with tears. "I think I judged you because I was afraid you'd judge me first. I came from nothing, Margaret. My parents worked themselves to the bone to give me a better life. When I finally married into money, I promised myself I'd never feel small again. But that promise turned into a cage. It made me forget who I really was." Her voice cracked. "Then I saw you. You had every reason to try and impress us, and you didn't. You were calm, proud, even when I treated you like you were less. That kind of strength, it shook me." I placed a hand over hers. "True strength doesn't shout, Linda. It whispers and waits." She looked at me for a long time, her eyes glistening. "I'm grateful you didn't fight me. If you had, I would have doubled down. I would have convinced myself I was right. But your silence, it was like a mirror I couldn't avoid." We sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Outside, the wind rustled the trees and Clara sighed in her sleep. After a while, Linda smiled through her tears. "Do you ever think people like us were meant to meet? That maybe the universe put us together so we could teach each other something?" I laughed softly. "Maybe. Or maybe life just has a funny way of balancing pride with patience." She laughed too, wiping her eyes. "You really should have been a teacher." "I was," I said, smiling. "Just not in the way you think." From that day on, Linda and I became more than just family. We became friends. Not the kind that talk every day or agree on everything, but the kind who understand each other without needing to explain. She started joining me at community projects, even helped fund a program for single mothers who wanted to start small businesses. "This is for women like you," she said when she announced the first grant. "Women who don't ask for sympathy, just opportunity." When I heard her say those words, I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. I didn't clap. I didn't need to. Some victories are quiet. They don't need applause. Months passed, seasons changed, and life settled into a rhythm that felt peaceful. Daniel and Emily were thriving. Clara was growing fast, curious eyes, a little smile that lit up every room. Linda and I spent many afternoons together, sipping tea, talking about everything from motherhood to forgiveness to the strange, winding paths life takes. One afternoon, Emily brought out an old photo album, pictures from the wedding, the baby shower, holidays we'd shared. As we flipped through the pages, I paused at one photo. Me and Linda standing side by side at the wedding, glasses raised, smiles soft but knowing. "Funny," I murmured, "how we were pretending to be polite back then, while secretly testing each other." Linda laughed. "And now look at us," I nodded. "It's amazing what grace can build when pride finally steps aside." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You were right that day, you know. About family not being about background or status. I used to think belonging was about fitting in. Now I know it's about showing up with an open heart." Her words stayed with me long after she left that evening. I thought about how many relationships break under the weight of ego, how many hearts go cold because someone decides being right matters more than being kind. I had almost gone that way myself years ago, almost become bitter, defensive, constantly needing to prove my worth. But life had taught me that silence, when rooted in truth, has a power louder than any argument. I realized then that pretending to be poor and naive wasn't just an act, it was a lesson for both of us. By lowering the walls around myself, I'd exposed hers. By letting her underestimate me, I'd given her the space to rediscover humility. Sometimes, the best way to reveal someone's true nature isn't by challenging them, it's by standing still long enough for them to see themselves clearly. When I held Clara in my arms later that night, I whispered softly to her, "May you never mistake money for love, and may you always see people with your heart before your eyes." She opened her tiny hands, as if reaching for something unseen, and I smiled. Linda and I would never forget how we began, the tension, the quiet pain, the lessons learned. But now we shared something deeper, understanding. We had both walked through the fire of pride and come out softer, stronger, kinder. Years later, when Clara would ask me how her grandmothers became such close friends, I'd simply say, "We met as strangers, tested each other as women, and found each other as mothers." Because that's what life is. Really, one long series of misunderstandings, waiting for patience to turn them into lessons. And in the end, the woman who once looked down on me became one of the few people I trusted to stand beside me. There's something strange about growing older. You start to realize that the moments that once hurt the most become the ones that taught you the most. The arguments that left you sleepless, the misunderstandings that made you cry, the silences that stretched too long, all of it starts to make sense when you look back with softer eyes. Now, when I sit by my window every evening, watching the sky turn that quiet shade of amber before dusk, I think about how much my life changed because of one simple choice. The choice to stay calm when pride begged me to fight back. It's easy to speak loudly when you're hurt, easy to defend yourself, to prove your worth, to demand respect. But it takes a different kind of strength to stay silent. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of understanding. The silence that says, "I know who I am. I don't need to prove it to you." That was the silence I carried the day Linda tried to humiliate me. And though it burned at the time, that quiet became my armor. Because sometimes dignity speaks loudest when your voice doesn't. After all these years, people still ask me about Linda, how we managed to build a friendship after such a rocky start. They can't believe it when I tell them she's now the godmother to my granddaughter, that she calls me almost every week, that we even take trips together now and then. They think forgiveness is a weakness, but I tell them the truth. Forgiveness isn't surrender, it's freedom. You don't forgive people because they deserve it. You forgive them because you deserve peace. I remember one evening, it was just last year, Linda and I were walking through the garden behind my house. The air was cool, the roses were in full bloom, and the crickets had just started singing. She stopped suddenly and turned to me. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" "Not speaking up that night at dinner. When I insulted you," I smiled. "No," I said softly. "If I had spoken, I would have spoken from anger. And anger doesn't heal. It only proves pain." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I wish I'd learned that sooner. We stood there quietly, two women who had once been enemies, now bound by something stronger than friendship, respect. That night, after she left, I sat alone on the porch and thought about how far we'd come. Life has a funny way of teaching lessons through the people we least expect. Linda was never meant to be my rival, she was meant to be my mirror. A reflection of what unchecked pride looks like, and a reminder of what patience can do when you trust it. When I think of all the years that passed between that dinner and now, I see a story not of conflict, but of transformation. We both changed. We both softened. We both learned that being right isn't the same as being kind. And maybe that's what wisdom really is, not a collection of facts, not a measure of success, but the ability to see beyond your own hurt and choose peace instead. These days, when young people ask me for advice, especially young women stepping into marriage or motherhood or careers that challenge them, I tell them this. The world will try to test you in quiet ways, not through big battles, but through small humiliations. Someone will underestimate you, mock you, dismiss you, and you'll want to fight back. Don't, just stand in your truth. The world notices grace, even when it pretends not to. It took me years to understand that the people who try to make you feel small are usually the ones who fear being small themselves. Linda didn't insult me because I was less. She did it because deep down, she worried she wasn't enough. So when I chose not to respond with bitterness, I unknowingly gave her the chance to see herself, not as my judge, but as a woman still learning how to be gentle. And I think that's what changed everything. Sometimes love doesn't look like flowers or kind words, sometimes it looks like patience. Like choosing not to throw stones even when you're standing knee-deep in them. There's a quiet kind of power in that. When I look at Clara now, bright-eyed, laughing, curious about everything, I see hope. I see a future where she'll grow up surrounded by women who've learned from their mistakes, who've chosen understanding over pride. And maybe that's the real legacy we leave behind. Not money, not property, not our names etched on anything grand, but the lessons that echo through the lives we've touched. Someday, when I'm gone, I hope she remembers me not as the grandmother who stayed silent, but as the woman who knew when silence spoke louder than words. Because that silence wasn't emptiness. It was full of faith, of dignity, of love that refused to bow to anger. And if you take anything from my story, child, take this. Don't let someone else's pride steal your peace. Don't waste your energy proving your worth to people who can't see it. And never mistake quiet for weakness. Sometimes it's the bravest sound in the room. I've lived long enough to know that peace doesn't come from being right. It comes from being real. From accepting that every person you meet is fighting a battle you can't see, and every unkind word they throw your way is more about their pain than your value. So next time life tests you, when someone underestimates you, talks down to you, or tries to make you question your worth, remember my story. Remember that grace isn't about letting people walk over you. It's about walking past them without losing your balance. And when you do, child, you'll understand what I finally did, that the loudest victory in this life isn't the one the world can hear. It's the quiet peace that lives inside you when you know you handled pain with dignity. Because in the end, that's the kind of peace no one can take away. You know, when I look back on everything that happened, all the pride, the silence, the waiting, I realize something simple, something we all learn too late in life. Not every battle needs to be fought, and not every wound deserves a scar. Sometimes what people say about you isn't a reflection of who you are. It's just the echo of their own fear. And when you learn to let that echo fade, you start to hear something much quieter, much truer, your own peace. I remember that dinner table like it was yesterday. The way the light hit the silverware, the tightness in my throat, the weight of every word that wasn't said. Back then, I thought silence made me small. But now I know it made me whole. Because silence, when chosen out of strength, is not weakness. It's wisdom. It's the sound of a soul that knows its worth. Linda taught me that in her own way. Not through kindness at first, but through her flaws, through her fear of being seen as less. She reminded me that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones most desperate to be understood. And I think we both saved each other. I saved her from pride, and she saved me from bitterness. Funny, isn't it? How the heart has a way of finding healing in the most unexpected hands. Years have passed now. The children are grown. The house is quieter than it used to be. Sometimes when I walk through the garden at dusk, I can still hear laughter from years ago. The clinking of glasses, the rustle of dresses, the tiny sounds that used to fill our days. And I smile. Because even though life has taken so much, it's given me more than I ever asked for. It's given me peace. If I could go back and tell that younger version of myself anything, I'd whisper to her, don't rush to defend yourself. Time will do it for you. Just live kindly, and truth will find its way through. Because it always does. We spend so much of our lives trying to prove that we're good enough. For love, for respect, for a seat at someone's table. But what I've learned is this. You don't need anyone's permission to belong. You already do. The table was always yours, even if they didn't see it. And one day when the noise quiets down, the same people who doubted you will look back and realize it wasn't luck that kept you standing. It was grace. So, if you're listening to this right now, if your heart is heavy because someone tried to make you feel small, I want you to remember something. Your silence is not surrender. Your patience is not weakness. And your peace is not up for debate. The world may not always applaud kindness. But kindness, child, it always leaves a mark. Because the truth is, forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing what deserves to stay in your heart. And when you choose peace, you don't just free them. You free yourself. So tonight, when you lay your head down, don't replay the arguments. Don't count the times you were wronged. Instead, count the times you stayed soft when the world told you to harden. Count the moments you chose love over ego, because that's what strength really looks like. Not in raised voices, but in quiet hearts. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone tries to test your worth, you'll smile, hold your peace, and let the silence do the talking. Peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the decision not to carry it anymore.